The rainy season had arrived earlier than usual, and the thick canopy overhead formed a dripping, living ceiling that amplified every creak and rustle within the research outpost. No one could leave, no one dared to wander beyond the perimeter. Thick mud sealed the wheels of the stalled transport truck, caked around the doors of the smaller research vehicles, and barricaded the compound's exit gates. The once humming settlement, which had served as a vital station for studying the rainforest microclimate, now felt like a tomb. But the outpost residents had more immediate worries than the downpour. Something else, something hostile, was stirring among the vines and branches, something that cradled madness in a whisper they could all hear. Dr. Clara Morales used to love the sound of the rainforest. She'd marveled at how thousands of distinct noises blended into a kind of symphony. The calls of birds, the distant roar of waterfalls, and the raising stridulations of insects. But lately, the chorus had been warped by a haunting tone, an echoing voice that meandered through the compound's flimsy walls as if carried by smoky tendrils. She knew it wasn't a simple wind or the hum of generator fans. It whispered, an almost intelligible language, one that seemed to lurk just beyond the realm of human comprehension. She sometimes thought she caught words in her mother tongue, Spanish, but never clearly enough to be sure. It was more akin to a presence, a trembling in her skull, a shiver at the base of her neck that refused to dissipate. At first, it was easily dismissed as the product of too many nights spent in the damp heat and too few hours of real sleep. Most members of the small team, separated from the outside world by the fierce storms, tried to keep to routine. But their scheduled tasks, collecting soil samples, testing water purity, mapping microhabitats, had become afterthoughts. Whenever someone stepped outside to gather data, they came back covered in fresh bruises and cuts. The forest floor seemed to fight them, tangling boots and snagging arms with vines. Men and women alike complained not just of external hazards, but of a feeling they couldn't name. It wrapped around their minds like tangling fronds. The compound's main building was an L-shaped structure with a common area, dining hall, and a lab that doubled as a medical bay when emergencies arose. There, Dr. Morales found herself tending to these inexplicable injuries. She was no medical doctor, but she had training in field triage. Bandaging crushed ankles and disinfecting mysterious lacerations had become part of her daily routine. Increasingly, Saren the meteorologist, who was often out in the harshest conditions to collect data, seemed dazed and erratic. His unsteady hands gripped the edge of the communal table whenever he entered the lab, eyes darting to corners of the room where nothing moved. He'd whisper about nightmares in which the trees themselves leaned into him, breathing foul secrets into his ear. "I hear them day and night now," he confessed to Clara one evening. A fresh scratch curved along his jaw. "When I lie down, the words are there. They're not just rustles or hisses. They chant in unison. And the worst part is..." His voice cracked. "I'm starting to understand them." Clara tried to muster a reassuring smile, but fear churned in her gut. She wanted to tell him to rest, to take some sedatives from the locked cabinet, but the medication had run low. The few vials left had been fiercely guarded, and no one truly wanted to dull their senses in a place like this. "Our supplies helicopter will come," she told him, though the storm made that promise fragile. "We'll get out of here soon. Just try to..." He cut her off, face tight. "I can't shut them out anymore. It's like they're in my bones." She knew he wasn't alone. Several others at the outpost had begun reacting similarly. Evie, the botanist, had locked herself in her quarters 2 nights ago, refusing to emerge except to retrieve minimal rations. There was talk among the staff that she would hunch in the corner, muttering. Others reported nightmares, insomnia, and abject terror of venturing outside. The forest was no longer the realm of science and wonder. It was a black labyrinth filled with eyes and voices that mocked their delusions of containment. Late that night, Clara stole a few moments to examine the persistent hum outside the lab window, picking through it like a musician straining to isolate a single instrument. Beneath the insect calls and the rustling of leaves in the storm, she perceived a low moan, almost like the breath of a panicked animal or a childish wail. She pulled the shutters closed. The next morning arrived sweltering. The crew avoided the battered metal steps and thick puddles outside, worried that the mud might seize their boots in a vice-like grip. But they had no choice. The daily data recordings had to be made, if only to maintain something that felt like normalcy. With forced determination, Clara led a small group out to the perimeter to check the gauge stations. Armand, their field technician, walked ahead. He paused at the tree line and motioned for everyone to keep quiet. Then, with a trembling finger, he pointed at a large trunk. High on the trunk's bark, they could see a swirling pattern, as though vines had grown tight, scarring the wood. Were it not for its unnatural precision, the pattern might have gone unnoticed. But now that it was illuminated by the morning glow, the twisting shape looked like a face contorted in agony. Armand stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. At a glance, it appeared the bark had peeled away in places, forming dark hollows for eyes and a gaping hole for a mouth. From within that cavity, something crawled, some insect large enough to create a faint, buzzing drone. Clara crouched, transfixed by the eerie figure. It felt as though the jungle was mocking them, shaping itself into a reflection of their nightmares. It's just a fungus or parasite that's burrowed and eroded the bark, Clara declared, hoping to maintain composure. We can document it, and Armand didn't let her finish. With a strangled cry, he stumbled backward onto the muddy ground. It spoke to me, he rasped, eyes wide with hysteria. It told me something about the final harvest. I heard it. Clara and the others tried to help him up, questioning him to see if he had hurt his head, but Armand was beside himself, trembling uncontrollably. All the while, the forest felt as if it had closed in, unyielding and furious. Even the wind had died, reducing the world to the pulse of their own hearts and the persistent drone from within the nightmarish pattern on the bark. Clara didn't wait to explore further. She and two interns half-lifted, half-dragged Armand back to the compound. Inside the cafeteria, they set him down on a bench. A few others hovered, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. Clara turned to them, trying to project steady authority. "He's exhausted," she said. "Seeing that bizarre growth on the tree probably just—" Armand's voice rose, cutting through her explanations. "We have to go, now. They're going to kill us. The forest, it wants us gone." "How?" asked Clara softly. She thought about the flooding, the crumbling roads, and all the illusions that lurked outside. "We can't travel in this storm. We'd sink in the mud or get lost. The river is practically unrecognizable now." Panic fluttered through the group. Carla, a communications officer, began fussing with the shortwave radio equipment, searching for any stable frequency that might connect them to the outside. All she got in return was static. She fiddled with the knobs, rotating through every channel. At a moment's glitch of clarity, a distorted voice emerged from the speakers, then vanished. She jolted upright in excitement, only to realize it had been no ordinary human voice. It sounded reminiscent of the chanting that infiltrated their dreams. She raced to shut the radio off, her complexion ashen. Morales grabbed her by the shoulders, forcing her to take a deep breath. "We'll figure this out," she insisted. "Stay calm." But calm was no longer an option. The night of that same day brought a thunderstorm so violent that the outpost's steel framework groaned in protest. Everyone huddled in the common area, which was plagued by flickering lights. The generator's fuel was running dangerously low, forcing them to ration electricity. Darkness pressed against the walls whenever the lights blinked out, and in the hush between claps of thunder, the forest voice returned in surges. It was no longer a faint whisper. It was a choral drone that seemed to vibrate in their rib cages. 1,000 throats chanting in unison, a swirl of syllables that made the walls tremble. Whispers swam in Clara's ear, telling her, "Leave, trespasser. There is no place for you." The voice emerged from deep inside the hollow recesses of her mind, so she was never sure if it was real or imagined. Soren doubled over, hands pressed to his head, whimpering that he could almost make out each repeated word. Meanwhile, others pressed their palms to their ears, eyes wild. Clara realized they were witnessing a complete collapse of mental discipline. The forest was suffocating them with primal power. That same night, one of the interns, Kaylee, vanished. She was there at dinner, but afterward nobody saw her retire to her bunk. She simply disappeared. Her gear remained untouched, though her poncho was gone. Frantic searches at dawn revealed no trace of footprints beyond the perimeter fence, only a single handprint high on the chain link, like she'd climbed over. They sent out a search party, pushing aside labyrinths of ferns, crossing streams with water up to their hips. She climbed out of the search party, pushing aside labyrinths of ferns, crossing streams with water up to their hips. Clara listened desperately for any sound of Kaylee calling for help. Instead, the jungle responded with that maddening drone, shaping it into syllables that twisted and merged with the noise of trickling water. It began to rain again by mid-afternoon. The group retreated, half resigned to the fact that Kaylee was lost. Evie, who had rarely emerged from her locked room, stood outside in the corridor. She was soaked, head to toe, eyes feverishly bright, and for the first time in days, she seemed fully awake. "It told her to come," Evie said. "And I think I know where they're taking her. The big cecropia tree near the ridge, the one we used for preliminary canopy observations. The forest wants her there." Clara tried to suppress the chilling wave that rolled through her. She'd realized that Evie had apparently been listening to the forest more than the rest of them, possibly entering an even deeper communion with whatever presence hovered among the vines. Before she could question further, Evie raised a trembling hand to her ear as though hearing instructions. "I can lead you," she offered, voice wavering. She looked both terrified and mesmerized. Against her better judgment, Clara assembled a second, smaller team. They readied themselves to follow Evie under the partial daylight, hoping they'd find Kaylee before nightfall. 5 of them headed out wearing muddied boots slapping at swarms of mosquitoes, hearts pounding in the hush of the canopy. Even at midday, the thick weave of leaves subdued the light. They cut a path along a rarely used route, the ground littered with rotting vegetation that gave off a pungent odor. Vines hung from strangler figs like sinewy arms. Every so often, Evie would freeze, tilt her head, and say nothing for minutes. Then she'd continue, presumably guided by some private dialogue only she could decipher. Eventually, they reached the cecropia tree. A giant trunk soared overhead, broad leaves forming an umbrella that blocked the murky sky. At the base, they discovered Kaylee. She sat cross-legged, staring at nothing in particular. Rain trickled through the canopy and danced across her arms and cheeks, but she almost seemed in a trance. Relief flooded Clara, who rushed forward. Kaylee lifted her gaze, eyes wide with dread. "Don't," she whispered. "I can hear them. They want us to feed the forest. They want our fear." Her voice was hollow, as though it belonged to someone else. There were leaves and insects crawling through her hair, and dried blood crusted beneath her fingernails. Clara checked her vitals and found her pulse abnormally sluggish but steady. Kaylee's eyes fluttered closed and she slumped, as though exhausted. They tried to help her stand. Her knees wobbled when she rose, and she moaned softly. "The forest will show the truth," she murmured. Though Kaylee swayed, she managed to open her eyes and point a trembling finger upward. Clara followed that line of sight to see another swirling pattern high up on the trunk. It resembled the face they'd found earlier, only this one was more explicit. It had pale shades forming eyes that almost glowed in the damp gloom. A wave of unease swept through the group as they witnessed a bizarre phenomenon. Pale lines that traced the bark began to expand, creeping like vines, as though the tree were responding to their presence. The lines carved deeper furrows, making the face appear contorted, opening its mouth in a silent scream. Everyone felt the force behind it, a living idea that had unleashed itself upon them. The chanting in their ears grew so strong that some clamped their hands over them. Then Evie whispered, "I hear it calling me, too." Clara turned to lock eyes with her. "Evie, no," she said firmly, grasping the other woman's wrist before she could drift forward. But Evie's bones felt liquid under Clara's grasp. With a sudden burst of strength, Evie tore free, stumbling toward the trunk. A triad of large, knotted roots seemed to open, exposing a hollow. The stench of rot drifted out. "We have to feed it," Evie said, her voice sounding almost reverent. "It's hungry for more than just our bodies." It wants our terror and madness. Her gaze flicked to Kaylee, who had begun trembling violently. It doesn't stop unless you let it in. Don't say that, Clara barked. She lunged forward, determined to yank Yi away, but the air pulsed with an unseen force that made her steps falter. The presence in the tree seemed to stretch out intangible limbs, weaving fear through all of them. Kaylee turned and stumbled toward Evie, arms outstretched, but Clara pulled her back. The chanting exploded in her skull, calling each of them by name, some silent recognition that in the depths of this green, breathing labyrinth, they were never alone. Out of nowhere, Soren crashed through a tangle of vines behind them. He must have followed them. Panting, sweat glistening on his brow, he cried, "We have to burn it! The outpost! The forest!" He sounded almost delirious, brandishing a flare gun they used for emergencies. "We can't let this spread. It feeds on our fear, but if we destroy the heart, maybe it dies." He leveled the flare gun at the trunk. For an instant, Clara couldn't decide whether Soren was insane or if he'd stumbled onto some fragment of truth. Disorienting confusion consumed her, and a wave of doubt cut through her sense of logic. Could the forest speak? Could it devour minds? Everything she'd seen, the swirling bark faces, the chilling whispers, suggested something beyond the rational. The roar in her head was deafening, but no flame erupted. Soren's hand shook too violently to steady his aim. When he finally pulled the trigger, nobody stood quite far enough away to avoid the recoil. The flare soared off course, streaking the ground between the low roots. It ricocheted against wet bark and fizzled out in the mud. The forest responded with a risen chant, louder and more visceral, as if mocking their feeble attempt at rebellion. Claire clenched her jaw. "Shokia, help me get them out of here," she called to Soren, gesturing to Evie and Kaylee, whose vacant or hypnotized expressions terrified her more than any chaos or storm. A deeper part of her believed that if they stayed any longer, no one would make it back. It cost them tears, sweat, and raw desperation to lead both women away from the tree. Evie howled, fighting to break free, her mind entangled in the jungle's furious siren call. Kaylee swayed in and out of awareness, sometimes mumbling that she could see ephemeral shapes drifting through the trees. Rain battered them in relentless sheets, and the ground formed rivers of thick mud beneath their feet. Vines seemed to lash at them. They stumbled past rotted logs, outpacing that haunting voice that dogged their every step. Eventually, the compound appeared through the haze of standing water and twisted vegetation. Collective dread settled the moment they re-entered the outpost. The others who had remained behind looked up with hollow stares, as though any last vestige of hope had drained away. Carla had abandoned the radio. She stood in the corridor, arms wrapped tightly around herself, trembling to the bone. Armand sat on the floor, regarding Evie's shrieks with a distant gaze. Clara found no solace in the flickering interior lights. The next several hours unspooled in frantic confusion. Evie's screams grew inhuman. She battered her fists on steel tables, howling about hungry roots and dripping vines. Soren and Clara wrestled her into a storage room for her own safety, tying her hands loosely so she wouldn't hurt herself. Kaylee, meanwhile, remained catatonic. Claire administered the last of their sedatives to help her rest, terrified of what Kaylee's mind might be exposed to if she was left conscious in that raw mental state. By midnight, only a handful of them remained coherent. The generator sputtered its last as fuel lines ran dry, darkness flooding the corridors. A single lantern stood in the center of the common area, painting trembling shadows on the walls. Everyone else huddled around it in grim silence. The forest voice was now as constant as their own heartbeats, never pausing, never yielding. Some claimed it sang of revenge. Others felt it lamented centuries of human intrusion. Clara couldn't parse meaning from the swirling, layered whispers. She just sensed immeasurable hatred, like the wrath of a colonized territory reclaiming itself. Through the open window slats, accompanied by the relentless drumming of rain, the chanting gained momentum, weaving itself into a harsh funeral dirge. Clara sensed her own paranoia spiking. Any minute, the outpost walls might collapse, letting the vines pour inside. Or perhaps the force behind that intangible presence would simply crush their minds, rendering all of them mindless husks. She prayed for daybreak, though she knew daylight wouldn't banish the voices. The storm abated just before dawn. Wind parted the roiling clouds, allowing a sliver of early light to peek through and glisten on puddles. In the hush that followed, the chanting receded to a faint hiss. Clara forced her stiff limbs to move, creeping to the door. She slowly opened it, letting gray light spill inside. A disturbingly calm hush hung over the compound's yard. Birds did not call, no insects buzzed. The hush itself was unnatural. Soren joined her, the two of them scanning the edge of the forest. Vines sagged under the weight of clinging dew, and enormous leaves twitched in occasional gusts. Despite the menacing gloom, it was an opportunity to attempt an escape. If they didn't seize it, the forest might reclaim them completely. She turned to find Carla, who still clung to the possibility of remote communication. "We have to try the eastern path," Clara said. "We might make it to higher ground near the helipad site. The helicopter might even be searching for us." Carla gave a hollow nod, and they gathered the others, half leading and half carrying Kaylee, whose sedation kept her from speaking. Evie's eyes brimmed with near delirium, but she could walk with some support from Armand. Their group of survivors stepped carefully into the steamy air, hearts pounding, senses on high alert. Their plan was to skirt the perimeter, then cut across what used to be a dirt road. They prayed it wasn't completely eroded by the storm. At first, no immediate hostility confronted them. The deeper they ventured into the saturated forest, however, the more ominous the silence became. Soft clay sucked at their boots. The trees exuded a thick, pungent odor of decaying flora. The sense of being observed was overwhelming. More than once, Clara glanced up to find twisted patterns in the bark, ephemeral faces carved by fungus or vine. The eyes in those shapes seemed to follow them. Holding on to a fragile thread of determination, they pressed on. The sun inched higher, lighting patches of ground to reveal how dangerously the earth had shifted in the storms. Gullies had formed where none existed before, and newly exposed roots snaked across the forest floor. Eventually, they heard water roaring in the distance. The old river path must have swelled beyond recognition. Clara felt the forest's watchful presence intensify with every step, as though it were funneling them toward a dark fate rather than letting them escape. Attempts at conversation died. Everyone walked as though in a trance, enveloped by the labyrinth of green. The chanting teased at their consciousness, attacking each mental vulnerability. Soren, leading the group, abruptly froze. The path ended at a collapsed slope, a churn of mud and toppled trees. The route to the high ground seemed blocked by debris. Worse, those vines creeping through the gap looked like serpents lying in wait. Fear splashed through Clara's veins. She realized they might not bypass it. "Is there another route?" Carla whispered, eyes darting feverishly. She clutched Kaylee's arm, but Kaylee remained unresponsive, swaying in the drizzle. Clara was about to suggest they try to scale the slope when movement flashed under the fallen trunks. It was subtle, but enough to make them recoil. Something slid across the wet bark with an unsettling hiss. Meanwhile, the forest found its voice again. A shiver crawled up Clara's spine as the hum spiraled, rising in pitch as if orchestrating a final confrontation. After all they'd endured, the rainforest would either consume them or let them live. Gathering every last bit of courage, Clara raised her voice, forcing it not to tremble. "We are leaving," she declared to no one but the ceaseless hush. "We will not stay." Silence answered. Then, a whirlwind of hissing leaves rustled overhead, making them flinch. In that fleeting moment, a beam of morning sunlight sliced through the canopy like a blade, illuminating a narrow slope on the side. The path was muddy, but passable. Without another word, they seized the opportunity, scaling the slope one by one, hearts hammering, breath ragged in their chests. Mud caked their clothing. Once at the top, they found the forest parted just enough to allow them forward. It was as perilous as picking their way across the edge of a cliff, but they pressed on. Gradually, the chanting subsided. The hush of the rainforest returned to something closer to normal, still teeming with life, but no longer possessed by the single sinister chorus that had plagued them. They glimpsed the shape of higher ground. From there, they might secure a vantage point or find a clearing for a rescue helicopter. Evie staggered, no longer raving as wildly, her face slick with tears and rain. Kaylee breathed shallowly, eyes closed. Armand and Carla gripped them by their arms, helping them continue. The final approach was a crawl through tangled brush. Scrub palms ripped at their clothes, and biting insects swarmed them. But at last, they emerged onto a plateau of rock that jutted out, offering a panoramic view of the jungle below. The morning sun finally broke through the storm clouds, painting the canopy in shimmering gold and green. A collective hush fell over them, this time without the haunting resonance of the chanting. Instead, they heard the rustle of leaves in a breeze that smelled sweet and mild, as if the forest had withdrawn its wrath. Soren, sagging with relief, sank to his knees. Carla gently laid Kaylee against a small boulder, checking her temperature. Evie collapsed, her trembling eaves. The tension in Clara's shoulders dissipated just enough that her breath came in ragged heaves, tears burning in her eye. They had escaped, if only for now. Below them the jungle stretched vast and ancient, the outpost hidden in its emerald gloom. In the hush, Clara could almost feel the forest's final reminder that it had the power to choose. The madness might remain embedded in the trunk hollows and vines, waiting for the next intrusion. She did not doubt their experience. Some primal intelligence had made its will known, forcing them to either submit or flee. Her chest tightened when she realized that the research data they had fought so hard to collect would be left behind, but that mattered less than surviving. A final breeze swept across the plateau, shaking droplets from the overhanging leaves. The beams of sunlight shifted, bringing a vague warmth. No one spoke for a long time. The calls of distant birds resumed, as if nature's order tentatively returned. Deep in the undergrowth below, the ephemeral chanting might still murmur, but at this altitude it was almost out of earshot. They would find a way to contact help from here, or make their way around the ridgeline to the next station. Perhaps the madness would linger in their dreams, but at least the living nightmare had loosened its grip long enough for them to escape. Soren, rising unsteadily, placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "We made it," he whispered, though his eyes betrayed lingering terror. Clara's gaze fell upon the green sea of leaves, the faint outline of the outpost rooftops in the distance. "Yes," she murmured, "this time." In the hush, the distant forest breathed a final sigh, and somewhere in its depths, the sinister voice of the jungle receded back into the shadows. Yet as Clara closed her eyes, she could still sense that quiet resonance pulsing through her mind, reminding her that they had never been alone, and never would be.